so hopefully you all can hear me, and welcome to everyone. Last week, we tackled a very controversial and difficult subject, especially in Israel, the subject of conversion and what possible solutions we might have to the conversion crisis. Today, we're going to tackle another very controversial and we're going to tackle another very difficult topic, and that essentially is the subject of serving in the army in Israel, or anywhere actually, versus studying in yeshiva. And this is first of all connected to our parsha, because in Parshat Shoftim, we are talking about those who are exempt from war. The Torah gives three basic categories of those who ostensibly will not be able to focus on the subject at hand, on fighting against the enemy, because they are concerned, either newly married, or perhaps they just built a house, planted a field. We don't want them to miss out on one of these most important elemental experiences in life. Although the commentators tell us that the real reason for exempting soldiers is if they are afraid. Maybe they're afraid just in terms of being harmed, being killed, God forbid. Maybe it's because they are afraid they don't have the spiritual or moral excellence that Hashem demands, and maybe they won't be protected by Hashem. This is in our parsha, along with a very fascinating job in the army, the Moshiach Milchama. He's a Kohen whose job it is to go with the army, to inspire the army, to give them a pep talk, so that they are reinforced that if they have faith in Hashem and if they follow orders, then they're going to succeed. Next week, we're going to also talk about more issues with the army. We begin Ki tetzei milchama al oivecha, when you go to war against your enemy, and many of the things to follow, including what we call in Hebrew Tor Haneshek, purity of arms, which is a concept that comes from the Torah, to conduct ourselves. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, in a very unique and moral way as Jewish soldiers. But this has become obviously a very supercharged, divisive issue, because those who send their kids to Tzahal see those who don't participate in the IDF as being abusers of the system or parasites even, and not carrying the burden that everyone should be carrying. Those who are studying in yeshiva see perhaps the army as being something which is tameh, something which is going to have a negative effect on their spiritual self, on their maintaining their religiosity, and moreover see their learning Torah as being the key element of Israel winning all these wars. Baruch Hashem Kein Yirbu. Most of them, if not all of them, by purely miraculous assistance from the Almighty, and that comes from the study of Torah, etc. And it has become obviously a very, very divisive issue. We're coming up for another election, and essentially the Haredi parties, who are not in the current government, but always align themselves with the Likud, they basically have only two requirements for joining a coalition. One, their children will not serve in the army, and two, they will receive the money they deem necessary for their religious institutions. And this has created a tremendous amount of machloket in Israel. It's not something that is new, but it's become exacerbated. The truth is that Ben-Gurion made a deal in which he said, we can exempt the yeshiva students. They do not have to go to the army. And this was agreed upon early in the early years of the state, but at that time there were only 400 yeshiva students receiving exemptions. Today that number has surpassed 20,000. And in many communities, there's not a single young person that is going to the army, even those who are perhaps totally unqualified to be sitting and learning. Not everybody can sit for 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 hours a day studying. So it's become very controversial, and we're going to try to take a closer look at the whole issue of war. War has been with us, unfortunately, since time immemorial, and certainly a part of the Israel scene. Whenever we had a country, whenever we were controlling our own destiny, we always had our own army. In the times, of course, of Shaul HaMelech, who was a soldier, David HaMelech, who was a great strategist and a soldier who conquered Yerushalayim and who fought 18 wars, and on throughout history. So war has always been with us, which sends the message that we've certainly have miracles every day, but we go through life b'derech hateva, in a natural fashion. And one of those things that we have to do is to assemble an army, and we have to fight. It's not a situation, I mean, there are a couple of very rare miraculous exceptions where we did not have to fight, but generally speaking, in all of the follow Tanakh, we are fighting against the Plishtim and against Ammon and Moab, etc. And we have to assemble, and the Torah talks at length about a draft that all of the able-bodied men have to serve. Today we have women serving as well. And that's simply a fact of life. So there's a great deal of discussion about the concept of war in halakha. Essentially, there are 3 types of wars that the Torah talks about. The first is a milchemet mitzvah, a commandment when you have to go to war. Those would be wars like the war against the 7 nations inhabiting Israel when we left Egypt and we entered. We had to conquer them under the leadership of Yoshua and the whole story of Yericho, etc. That was a milchemet mitzvah that everyone had to serve in. The war against Amalek was also a commandment that you had to go to war against Amalek. And the third example of a milchemet mitzvah is a defensive war where we were being attacked. So the war, the milchemet Yom Kippurim, the Yom Kippur War, was certainly an obligated war. It was not optional. We had to fight to save our country and to save lives. So anytime, and there are others who want to say that anytime we're in danger, that even if we haven't been directly attacked, that would be an obligatory war. Then there is milchemet reshut. That is a war that is optional. Most of the wars that David HaMelech fought were optional wars. They were done to expand the borders of Israel. Now, the difference between them is that a milchemet mitzvah could be declared by the king. The Rambam rules it doesn't have to be a king. As long as we have sovereignty, it could be whoever is in the position of a king or whoever is running the country to declare war. It doesn't need any more than that. But an optional war would have to be approved by the Sanhedrin. And of course, we don't have a Sanhedrin today. So an optional war would not be allowed. And then there is a third type of war, and that is kind of a little of this and a little of that. If, for example, to reduce the power of another nation because we're worried that in the future, this nation is going to attack us. They certainly don't speak like a friend of ours, and we're suspect of what's going to happen. So we try to instill fear into them by flexing our muscles. And this is a subject of dispute. The Rambam says you can do it, and others say, no, you can't do it. You would have to have the approval of the Sanhedrin. One could probably categorize the situation with Iran as such a war. They haven't, some would say they've already attacked us. If you want to hold that, then you can say that they've fired the first shot and we can answer. Others would say, well, they haven't yet mounted any kind of full-scale attack against us, and maybe we have to wait to see whether this can be resolved, etc. So these are the types of war, and they're not easy choices, but the bottom line is we have to protect ourselves at all costs. So we have differing opinions in terms of, are there those who are exempt or not, beyond those who are fearful? Of course, the Torah says you should not fear. And the Rambam says you basically convince yourself that I'm going to be safe, God is going to protect me. But there are people who may be conscientious objectors, and more or less every country, even when there is a draft, even in World War II, when there was an obligatory draft in America, there were conscientious objectors. There were people who served in different functions, and they were able to be exempted. The Torah allows for this also. For example, the tribe of Levi and the Kohanim, really the entire tribe of Levi, both Kohanim and Leviim, were technically exempt from fighting because they were meant to be the spiritual leaders, and therefore they were given a pass in order to pray for the soldiers and to study with the soldiers and to provide spiritual guidance and assist the army. Now, it should be noted that in those days when they were exempted, they often would accompany the army, and they would, before the soldiers went out to battle, they would study Torah with them, they would daven for them. And this is certainly something that is very admirable. I think today a lot of people would feel better if they knew that in the Haredi world, they were having pictures of the soldiers in front of them when they daven and when they learned. This indeed was a project that I know existed in American schools. But obviously these were, not obviously, but these were modern Orthodox Zionistic yeshivot, where they took the names and sometimes pictures of the soldiers, and they kept it with them while they were learning in order to pray for the welfare of the Chayalim. So there is already a kind of precedent to those who would be exempt from the army if they were studying. But this is very controversial because generally the wars, and this certainly might be applicable in times when we're at peace, those rare times that we're not under attack from anybody. But when you're under attack from someone, then it's a different situation. And essentially, everybody has to contribute in one form or another. There's a very difficult Gemara in Megillah that says, on Daf Tet Zayin, that Rav Yosef says, learning Torah is greater than saving lives. And this would seem to support those who say, I'm studying Torah, and that's more important than going to war. But the Shulchan Aruch says, it's not so simple, because we have a halacha that says that you can take money from a Torah fund to pay ransom to save the life of somebody. And that seems to be a complete objection. Therefore, some say that this statement of Rabbi Yosef is really more kind of agadita. It's more of a philosophical statement, but not a halachic statement. And certainly in times of war, in times of danger, just like you rise to defend yourself again as an individual against anyone who rises against you to harm you, to kill you, so you would do the same on a national level. And you would rise up as an army against those who seek to destroy you. And we know that in Israel, unfortunately, this is generally the case. On our border, we made peace with Jordan, we made peace with Egypt. Syria is in a state of war with us. Lebanon is in a state of war with us. And of course, we have the terrorist threat from within and without, from Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. And problems in Yehuda v'Shomron, etc. So nobody can possibly make the statement that we are in a peaceful situation, that nobody wants to harm us. So the question is, are we on solid ground in trying to require everybody in the country to serve in one form or another? Because we don't rely on miracles. And those who want to say, well, Hashem will protect us, unfortunately, we have situations like what we had, the massacre in Hebron in 1929. There was no relying on miracles in cases like that. There also is an issue of Chilul Hashem, of desecrating Hashem's name. If you're going to stay out of the army, if you're going to let other people do the job for you, even if you believe sincerely that you're doing something of value, are you creating this Chilul Hashem that divides the country and causes people to regard yeshiva students, and perhaps by extension, whatever they're learning, to be something which is divisive and destructive to the general community? You don't want a situation, and of course we know we have that situation where people are very basically become anti-religion, anti-dat, anti-Torah, anti-mitzvot, because they see the people who are learning Torah and keeping mitzvot not participating and helping in the national effort. And the fact that people say this is what is really saving you, it's not an easy thing for people who are sending their children into a war zone for them to accept that. I think that there have been attempts from some influential great rabbis to try to find a common ground. The Ger Rebbe, for example, who the leader, one of the largest Hasidic groups, I think Ger may be the largest of all the Hasidic groups, along with Satmar. But he, long ago, when he was head of the Moetzet Gedolei HaTorah, the head of the Haredi Religious Council, said that we ought to be doing something. At the very least, why don't we run the Batei Knesset in the army bases? Why don't we take care of kashrut? Why don't we do things that at least show that, along with our learning, we're making a connection to the army? Unfortunately, his proposal was not accepted. And if anything, the position of the Haredi world has hardened, so that there sometimes are mass protests and demonstrations, bringing traffic to a halt because one person is drafted in the army because he didn't sign papers of exemption. And we see this from time to time, and it's a terrible Chilul Hashem. So the other attempt that was made, two other attempts, one was Sherut Leumi, was national service, which has become, more than anything else, a way for women who are observant, who don't want to, or their family doesn't want them to serve in the army, to do some kind of national service, which at least is helping the country, whether it's serving in a hospital or whether it's also doing things that directly assist the army, but not in a military role. And the other institution, of course, is Hesder. Hesder is a program where you are combining Torah study and military service, essentially a 5-year program. And that was an attempt to kind of balance and include both aspects of learning Torah and fighting in the army. And that has been somewhat accepted in some of the Haredi communities. We've seen that this Netzach Yehuda battalion, which ostensibly is composed of Haredi individuals, Haredi men or boys, young men. In practice, it's really those from Haredi homes much more than those who have a Haredi lifestyle. And that's really what's going on there. Families don't want those boys to serve directly in the army, so they have their own unit where they have more time for davening, they have more time for Torah study, along with serving in a military capacity. And though that is growing, it's not widespread, although some people like to say that it is, but it is not really widespread. But the hope is that it's going to grow, and it's going to be a partial solution. But the debate goes on about which is the best course of action. It's interesting that I said before that in a more perfect situation, people were learning with those who went out to the army, and the troops would give a share in the days when troops and soldiers would take spoils, which we really don't do today. They would give that to the Talmidei Chachamim who were studying for them, and they formed this connection. Today we don't do that. We have this system of purity of arms, as I said before, and we do what we have to do, but we're not there. It's not like in the days where we conquered countries, when we plundered the people. In fact, just one personal story about our son Ari, Hashem Yikom Damo. He was on a mission searching for weapons that were hidden in Palestinian houses. And most of the houses, unfortunately, have secret hiding places for arms. Most of the Palestinians stockpile arms in their homes. That's what if they have money, that's what they spend it on. And so while he was looking for the weapons, he came across this false wall, and there were some weapons there that were hidden, and also a couple of $1,000s in $100 bills, US bills. And he brought it to his commanding officer, and he said, well, this is what I found along with the weapons. And the officer said, go back, give it to the owner of the house. We're not here to take money. We're here to confiscate illegal weapons. And some people, when I told the story, said, well, why should you give it to them? They'll buy more weapons. But this is the purity of arms, that we have this amazing moral army that, of course, the world turns everything on its head and tries to portray us as being immoral, but we know the opposite is true. As a matter of fact, one of the craziest but most illustrating about the bias against our army is that we have an almost zero percentage of rapes. Now, in most armies, probably the number one crime committed against the enemy would be raping of the women. And if you look back at the history of armies, this was always part and parcel. Soldiers were even told, you have free license to rape wherever you go. Israeli soldiers don't rape. And there was an article that was written by someone who tried to say in explaining why, instead of giving credit for the morality of the army, said Jews are so hateful of Arabs and Arab women that they won't even rape them. And this is actually something that happened, but it indicates, the level of animosity, but also the level of the morality that we have. So the question is, where will we go with this? There are sources either way. The Gemara talks about the fact that Abraham used soldiers when he went in this war against the four kings, if you remember that story, and therefore he was punished for it. But then we have the comment of the Gemara that says, in times of war, everybody fights. Afilu chatan michupato v'kala michupata. Even the chatan and kala, they leave their chuppah and they go and they fight. And I think, we're probably preaching to the converted in terms of understanding and thinking what is the way to go, but it's not so simple. There is a growing and very quickly growing Haredi community, and we have to try to find a way to bridge that gap. The government came out with something called the Tal bill some years ago, and that was a way of trying to soften the whole draft process in order to delay it, to give more time for boys to study, and then later on go into the Army. It's not been overly successful. It's always being challenged in the Supreme Court, and the issue is not going away. But this is one of the things, one of the challenges that we have, because you will see very, very vociferous and determined opinion on both sides of this. And it's not enough to simply state our opinion. We know what our opinion is because they have their opinion. And we can't bridge the gap necessarily by trying to convince people of our philosophy. And they say the same thing, that they can't really convince us. So this is a major struggle in Israel today. The hope is, as I said, that the Hesder community will grow, that the Haredi units will grow and will be more accepted. Unfortunately, we know that there are many, many stories of Haredi young people who enlist in the army and then are ostracized by their families, sometimes by their entire communities, and their families are told, if you don't ostracize your child because they're wearing a IDF uniform, then you will be asked to leave the community. And these things unfortunately happen. And the hope is that there, at some time in the future, and hopefully it won't be because there is a military crisis, but at some point we'll find a way to bridge the gap, and we will at one and the same time respect the fact that people who study Torah, that they're doing something that is very vital and something which is hopefully going to provide us with spiritual, miraculous, divine protection for many years, but at the same time, do it in a way that it doesn't create this kind of schism that exists in Israeli society today. So I can't offer any miraculous solutions and any quick solutions, but it's one of the things that I think the nation really has to, at some point, come to grips with, so that we are not so divided. And we see this by our constant elections, that this country is divided almost exactly 50-50. And that's not a good thing. That means that we can never get any kind of consensus or majority opinion. And this is one of the issues that divide us. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to ask Tal or Emre if you want to unmute people, or you can unmute yourself if you have a comment or a question that you want to ask. Okay. Anybody want to ask or say anything? You can unmute yourself if you want to.
I would like to say something.
Yes. Where are you? Okay. Yes.
I think that this problem has grown disproportionately because, and I'm choosing my words carefully, because of the cowardice of the non-Haredi population. If a country has laws, and this is surely one of the most important because it involves 2 or 3 years of people's lives. If you have these laws and you are willing to let large segments of the population violate those laws without significant consequence to the vast majority of them, you are creating an untenable situation in society that goes far beyond the draft, military service, or any of the other considerations. And it is, in my opinion, and always has been, a grievous error. During Vietnam, I almost left America because I did not want to serve in an unjust war. I didn't, and it's not pertinent to the story. But if you're not going to act on your conviction and you're going to permit lawlessness, you deal with the consequences. And that's what we're dealing with now.
I hear you. The problem, when the rabbis are able to rally 25,000 people who say, we'll go to jail before we go to the army, we don't have room for 25,000 people in jail. But I hear you.
Well then, let's make room or appropriate hotels for them without the meals.
Okay.
The reasons
I hear you.
The reasons you're giving are all true, but the consequence is so much greater than the price of enforcing the law.
Yes. Well, as Marcia, hold on, as Marcia Katz wrote, as the Haredi population grows, it's only going to exacerbate the situation because, you know, the percentage of young men, 18-year-olds, are going to be higher in the Haredi community, and we're going to need more and more soldiers. So it's only going to get worse.
Then change the law.
Go ahead, Alexa.
I think there are two issues here. I think that I agree with Marshall about laws, but from what I remember, there was a very quiet, very strong movement to silently encourage more Haredim to go into the army without making it front page news. And what happened when they decided to criminalize not going in the army, that is when everything blew up. Because they turned something, it is a community that is very sheltered and very suspicious of the outside world. Rightly, wrongly, or indifferently, it doesn't matter. They have to be handled differently. And it was working. I think they spent about 10 years trying to get people to go, and the whole thing blew up. That's number one. Number two, there's also a massive problem about going to work, because the idea is if you don't go in the army, it's much harder for you to find work. So they're trying to encourage the Haredi people to go to work, and who are beginning to understand they need to do this to survive. So those two things are connected, but you cannot force the issue. You have to deal with it in a way that respects and honors the Haredi community.
Okay.
There's the carrot and the stick. You can enforce the law and use the stick, but it doesn't work.
Right. Unfortunately, neither one is working too well at the moment.
Neither one.
Maybe it will.
Neither of them.
Maybe it will.
Actually, I think there is a lot more going on that we hear about.
Okay.
I think there are far more Haredim, and unfortunately, these Haredi boys who are ostracized from their families. That is what is so sad and so painful. They lose their whole families because of their desire to serve in the army.
I'm sorry, but the tragedy goes far beyond that. It extends to the vast majority of people who do not serve and do not realize their responsibility to the state that supports them in so many ways. And that's the bigger case than the few that are ostracized, as bad as that may be.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else want to make a comment?
I would just like to point out that I know everyone's talking about the Haredim, but there are various other groups, sectors of people who refuse to serve for various reasons. So you keep focusing on the Haredim, I know it's a large amount, but they're not the only ones, not for the same reason, but that don't want to serve.
By the way, Diana, you're exactly right. The percentage of those who are exempted or don't serve in the army is exactly the same between the Haredi community and the secular community. So you're quite right. And that is a huge problem in the secular community, who provide all kinds of ways on social media to fake fake being sick, fake being psychotic, and getting out of the army. And we should remember that as well. And I completely and totally agree with you that we should not only focus the cannons on the Haredim, but also on the secular community, which is essentially the same percentage of those who avoid the army. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. It's a very good point.
But doesn't a large sector of that community do some sort of Shirut Leumi?
Not necessarily, no. Some of them are just completely out, and it will hurt them in the workforce ultimately, because there will always be preference given to those who served in the army, especially in a combat unit. But if they dodge the draft, so to speak, then many of them get away with it, unfortunately. And obviously that in a situation that we face where we're against multiple enemies, that's not a good thing. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We will be back, stay posted. We may have to change the timing, but we'll put that out there so that if we need to change soon, we're going to have to change it because the clock is moving. And so we'll have to move. Just a reminder, those of you who are in Israel or coming to Israel, October 2nd is the annual Tshuva program with Rabbi Dr. Effie Kleinberg, Rabbi Hanoch Teller, and special guest Jonathan Pollard, who will all be speaking here on Sunday morning, October 2nd. So if you are interested, reserve with a WhatsApp to me or to Susie. And thanks to Emre and to Tal for hosting, and we'll see you next time. Everybody, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.